In that small town surrounded by hills that seemed to doze all day long, there was always a background sound. The crowing of roosters, the hiss of old radios, the sound of hurried footsteps at the market. And in the midst of it all, an absence, a kind of silence with a name. Lion, the adults said he was a different boy. The children only whispered. Some called him mute, others strange, but no one knew for sure why he didn't speak. And perhaps that's why no one stopped to listen to what he said with his eyes. Luan was 9 years old and had a pair of shoes that were always covered in dust. He walked slowly through the streets, as if he didn't want to disturb the ground. He didn't smile, he didn't wave, but he didn't seem sad either. There was something about him that was made of waiting. But what intrigued the city most, more than the silence, more than the large eyes that seemed to have been drawn in charcoal, was the fact that wherever he went, the dogs followed him. Not all, just some. Always the same. The oldest, the most injured, the ones no one wanted around. They formed a sort of silent entourage, walking at a measured pace behind the boy who did not speak to people, but who seemed to say a lot to the dogs. They said that once he stood for hours in an empty square, just him and a three-legged dog, exchanging glances as if reading an old book. Another resident swore he had seen a sick puppy lie on Luan's lap and days later get up cured, wagging its tail. No one could prove it, but everyone told. The city didn't know the names of all the dogs, but it knew his name. Luan, the boy who talked to dogs. And on that cloudy morning when the sun had not yet overcome the fog and the roosters seemed to crow more softly, a strange scene unfolded in the field near the abandoned school. There, among the tall grass, a circle of dogs formed around Luan. None of them barked, none of them moved. They just listened, and Luan in silence looked at the sky as if he was waiting for something to happen, or as if he already knew. Luan was born in a dry summer, one of those when the heat seems to stick to the walls and even the birds fall silent. They say that in the first months of his life he laughed easily and cried little. He was a calm baby, one of those who observes everything as if he came into the world knowing something. But everything changed one January afternoon. It was the day the car skidded on the dirt road returning from his grandfather's farm. An oversight, a lightning strike, a forgotten pothole. Luan's parents never came back. He, only 4 years old, survived with a scratch on his forehead and an invisible mark on his chest. After that day, Luan stopped talking. The doctors called it trauma. The grandmother, Dona Candinha, preferred to call it the protection of the soul. "He'll come back when the world knows how to listen," she said, as she made coffee and combed her silver hair in front of the cracked mirror. Grandmother was the only bridge between Luan and the rest of the city. A woman of faith, with hands worn out by bar soap and a rosary in her pocket. She raised her grandson with firm sweetness, protecting him from evil looks and empty questions. But even she sometimes found herself looking at the boy and wondering if she would ever hear his voice again. Luan was not unhappy, but there was a dense loneliness within him, made of silence and unsaid things. He preferred places where no one spoke loudly, the pasture behind the school, the bench in the park in the afternoon, the backyards of houses where dogs lived. The dogs understood him. Maybe it was the way he sat close to them, undemanding, or the way he reached out his hands slowly without fear or haste. Some said he smelled like a tree. Others said his eyes spoke for him. Luan drew a lot. Not big, colorful scenes, but details. The bristling fur of an old dog, the curve of another dog's drooping ear, the eyes of a dog who had lost his family. His notebooks were maps of stories that no one read, except the dogs themselves who seemed to recognize them in the air. At school, the teachers tried. The principal insisted, but he just listened and drew, The children laughed. Sometimes they barked as he passed. One or two tried to be kind but ended up moving away, overcome by the thick silence that surrounded him like a fog. And then, when the city seemed to have given up on understanding him, he met Juka. But that would come later. It was on a windless morning, one of those that seemed suspended in time, that Luan found Juka. The dog appeared on the corner of the main street, walking with a confidence that belied his condition. His fur, an amalgam of gray and brown, was dirty and tangled. He was visibly limping, with his left hind leg raised, but his eyes were different. As if they carried a story that didn't need to be told. A story of resistance. Luan saw him first. The rest of the street followed without noticing. But Luan noticed something that the others didn't see. Juka wasn't lost, nor without an owner. He was waiting. When the dog approached, Luan didn't hesitate. He didn't move away. He didn't look around. He held out his hand with the same silent calm he used with all dogs. And in a smooth movement, Juka lay down next to him as if he already knew him, as if he had always been there. He didn't bark or even move. He just leaned lightly against the boy as if looking for a safe haven after years of torment. Luan sat down, crossing his legs, and the two remained there, immersed in a stillness that seemed beyond the reach of anyone else. Juka, with his injured paw, stared at the horizon, as if the world around him were irrelevant, and Luan, with the same closed expression, seemed to understand that in a profound way. They were there, without words, sharing a silence that only solitary beings can achieve. Dona Candinha, always attentive to that silent friendship, watched from the window of the house. She knew her grandson had something special, something that, although no one else saw it, she was already beginning to perceive more clearly. It wasn't just pain that Luan carried. It was also a rare ability to connect with the invisible, with what couldn't be touched but you felt. In the days that followed, Juka never left Luan's side. He would appear every morning at dawn and lie down next to the boy while he drew. There were no words, no barking, just the comforting presence of two beings who had somehow found something in each other that could not be explained. However, Juka brought something more with him. Something beyond simple company. He carried a secret, something that in time Luan would begin to understand. The dog began to act differently from the other dogs. While most of the city's dogs were content to wander around the squares and wait for a piece of bread, Juka seemed to be watching over the city. He walked the streets, sniffed the lampposts, and stood still, observing the residents as if he were on a mission. Luan, with his silent eyes, also watched him. It didn't take long for him to realize something deeper in Juka's actions. The dog wasn't there just to be a friend. He was there to teach. The dogs, which had always been part of the city's everyday scene, began to behave differently. Suddenly, they approached the homes of elderly people, accompanied children down the street, and even seemed to warn residents when something was wrong. But no one could explain why. The residents, suspicious and curious, began to comment. The dogs are changing. And in the midst of all this, Juka continued to be the silent link. The dog, with his 3 legs and his deep scar, brought more than a story of pain. He held the key to something the city still did not understand. The first signs of transformation were small, almost imperceptible. They started with the dogs, of course. Juka, the silent leader, walked the streets, and wherever he went, there was something different in the air. It wasn't a grand change, but a subtle change, as if the world had decided to breathe more slowly, and people, without understanding, began to feel a lightness that had previously eluded them. Dona Candinha, Luan's grandmother was one of the first to notice. She sat in her rocking chair watching Juka and the other dogs move around. At first, she thought it was just a coincidence. The dogs were getting closer to the neighbors' houses as if they were bringing invisible comfort. But then something else happened. On a Thursday morning when the street was full of people going to work, Dona Candinha saw a man who lived at the end of the street. His name was Seu Jorge, a grumpy old man who spent his days grumbling and never smiled, sitting on the sidewalk with a stray dog lying next to him. It was the same dog as always, a skinny and elusive animal that no one paid any attention to. But that morning the man was quiet, looking at the horizon with tears in his eyes. It was a fleeting moment, but Luan's grandmother noticed the change. Seu Jorge, the man who rarely spoke to anyone, was silent, as if his solitude had been touched by something profound. Dona Candinha didn't understand, but she felt it. And deep in his chest, I knew something was going on. The city, once so hurried, began to slow down. Conversations in the squares seemed calmer. Fights between neighbors decreased, and most curiously, dogs, the same dogs that once lived in alleys and lonely streets, began to appear at the doors of houses, lying on the sidewalks or watching the windows with an attentive look. But what no one knew was that Juka carried with him a deep secret, and it wasn't just the comfort of a silent friendship. He was there to do something much more important. Conflicts began to arise when people began to realize that it wasn't just the dog's behavior that was changing. It was theirs too. One day, Dona Candinha saw her grandson Luan approaching a woman from the town. Dona Helena was known for her toughness. She didn't like children and avoided any contact with the other residents. But that day, something was different. Dona Helena was standing near the square, her eyes fixed on a mangy dog, and Luan, as always, approached slowly. "Hello, Miss Helena," he said for the first time in a long time. His voice, soft as a whisper, seemed to have been forgotten in time, but it was there somehow. "This dog is sad. He's in pain." Dona Helena looked at Luan with a disconcerting smile. Something moved inside her, something she didn't want to admit, but she couldn't deny what she felt. She slowly bent down and extended her hand to the dog, something she had never done before. The dog, previously shy and suspicious, approached and licked her hands. At that moment, Dona Candinha understood that Luan's silence was not empty. He had a silent communication that touched people's hearts, just as Juka had touched the entire city. What had begun as a quiet transformation was now beginning to stir the deepest roots of each of them. And this wasn't just about dogs. It was about the fear of opening one's heart, the difficulty of forgiving, the pain of moving on. In another house, Mr. Ricardo, who had spent his entire life running away from any kind of responsibility, began to notice that the dogs were getting closer to him. At first, he tried to push them away, but something changed. He would look at the small dog that was approaching, and for the first time in years, he felt an inexplicable urge to pet him. Once again, the silent presence of the dogs did something inside him. And then it started to happen. People started talking to each other more. It wasn't just any conversation, but a genuine exchange of feelings that words had long held. Dogs, in their simplicity, were disarming the most closed hearts. Luan, without ever having to say a word, was the catalyst for this transformation. With his calmness, he showed others that healing did not come from grand gestures or empty words, but from shared silence. What he and Juka were creating, without anyone knowing exactly how, was a city where pain could be seen, where lonely souls found peace in the company of animals. But that was still just the beginning. Something bigger was coming, something that would change not only the city but the destiny of Luan and all those who were about to discover the secret that Juka carried with him. On that gray afternoon, the sky seemed lower than usual, and the wind, which had previously passed silently, now carried something dense, like a promise. Luan was sitting on the porch of Dona Candinha's house, hookah by his side, quiet as always. But there was something in the air, something different that the boy felt without fully understanding. The smell of wet earth, the sound of dry leaves in the wind, everything seemed to indicate that something big was about to happen. It was at that moment that he heard the first barks, but not ordinary barks. They were not the happy barks of dogs playing, but something more urgent, something that could not be ignored. Luan stood up slowly, as if his body knew what was about to happen before his mind. He walked toward the sound, which was coming from the main street where all the dogs in town, including Juka, were gathered. They were silent now, but their eyes were fixed on something, or maybe someone. In the distance, he saw the figure of a man running down the dirt road, out of control, his arms waving in the wind, the sweaty face, the desperate expression. It was Seu Jorge, the man who had always been isolated. The same man who until then no one would have imagined capable of taking an impulsive action. But there he was, heading towards a destiny that seemed to have been written a long time ago. Luan felt his heart race. Something was happening. But what? Why was he running? Juka, for a moment, looked at the boy and with a light tap of his paw on the ground indicated that he should follow him. The path was not long, but it seemed endless. The sound of barking, now louder, echoed through the street. Luan ran after Juka with a feeling of foreboding that tightened his chest. When they reached the square, all the dogs were there. But more importantly, they were all focused on a single point. The bench in the square where a woman sat, with her hands clasped, staring at the ground, with an undefined expression, almost as if she were waiting for something. It was Dona Helena, and then the revelation came as sudden as the sun appearing between dark clouds. She looked at Luan as if seeing him for the first time, and a sad smile appeared on her face. "I knew you would come," she said, her voice low but clear. "I knew he was here to help me." Luan, with the serenity that characterized him, remained silent, observing her. Juka, with his deep and serene eyes, was now beside Dona Helena. He did not bark. He did not need to. It was then that Luan understood Juka's purpose and the secret he had been carrying. "Juka is not just a dog," Dona Helena said, her words coming out with a softness that seemed to embrace the soul of those who heard them. "He was sent to teach me to forgive, to help me understand that despite everything I have lost, life still has something to offer." She paused, looking at the dogs around her, as if each of them had been part of a larger plan. "When my son died, I closed myself off from the world. I couldn't speak anymore. I couldn't feel anymore. My heart was empty. But when Juka appeared, he taught me that even in pain there is a space for healing." Dona Helena looked at the dogs that were around her, as if they knew more than anyone could imagine. "I'm not the only one. Everyone here, the dogs and the people, everyone is being touched by something bigger than us. Something that no one fully understands, but what I do know, Luan, is that they choose us. Each one of them for a reason that only the heart can understand. Luan looked at Juka, and in his eyes he saw the silent wisdom of a being who had seen more than any human being could see. Juka didn't need to speak. His mission was now clear. He wasn't just there to give company to a lonely boy. He was there to be a beacon of light for all who, like Donna Helena, were lost in the dark. The dogs at that moment began to move toward the residence. The sound of their paws on the ground was a soft rhythm like a lullaby. They did not bark. They simply stood there as if they were gathered for something sacred. Something that connected everyone, human and animal alike, in a silent symphony of healing. And then the whole city seemed to awaken to something new. The sun was setting on the horizon, dyeing the sky a soft orange that spread throughout the city. The streets, once hurried and noisy, now seemed slower, more attentive, as if the city breathed along with the calm rhythm of the dogs walking alongside their owners. Luan was sitting on the porch with Juka lying beside him. The light wind swayed the trees, and the smell of the earth still carried the touch of a shared secret. The city, although small and simple, was now immersed in something deeper, an invisible connection that transformed not only the people but the very essence of the place. Dona Candinha, who could no longer stop smiling when she saw the change in people, felt that something magical had happened. It wasn't something visible to everyone, but it was something that could be felt. The pain and sadness that once dominated the streets had been softened by something gentler. Something no one could explain, but everyone knew it was there. The boy who didn't say many words and the dog who seemed to understand everything. That connection, silent and unbreakable, now extended throughout the city. The dog's eyes were no longer empty, they were full, filled with a wisdom that transcended human understanding. The healing that Donna Helena experienced was not a quick cure. It was not something that happened overnight. But she was slowly beginning to feel the weight of her own feelings eased. Every gesture of affection she gave to the dog, every look she exchanged with the neighbors, was a small victory against the pain that had been her companion for so long. Luan looked at the others, seeing the bonds being strengthened, not through big words, but through small actions, small gestures. People who were once so stuck in their routines and insecurities now looked at each other more carefully. The dogs, with their silent wisdom, were the messengers of this subtle but profound change. As the city reconnected, Luan knew that the transformation Juka had brought about was not something that could be easily explained. He knew that one day everyone would understand that true magic lay in simplicity, in the ability to listen without words, to touch the heart of another being without having to say a single sentence. That was what Juka had taught everyone. And then one night, while Luan was again with Juka on the porch, the dog slowly stood up and looked at him. It was a look of deep understanding, a kind of silent farewell, as if he knew his mission was complete. The boy looked back, with a mixture of gratitude and longing. Juka walked away, walking slowly as if he were fulfilling the last of his commitments. Luan watched him for a moment until he disappeared into the darkness towards the hills in the distance, where the stars were beginning to appear in the sky. The next morning, the city still breathed differently. People looked at each other with more compassion, more patience, and the streets, which had previously been mere passages, were now spaces for encounters and reconciliations. The city had been transformed, not by something grand, but by something profound and quiet. Luan knew that what had happened there was something that would never be forgotten. And although Juka was no longer physically present, he continued to live on in everyone's hearts, in every gesture of kindness, in every look of understanding. Juka's secret was not just about dogs. It was about the ability to heal, to connect, to transform lives. It was about the magic that lives in the simplest and quietest places, in the most humble gestures. As the city reorganized itself in the new rhythm of love and compassion, Luan understood for the first time what Juka had always known. Sometimes the greatest secret of all is not in the words we say, but in the actions we take, in the way we touch others without knowing we are doing so. And that is how the entire city was transformed, not by any act of greatness, but by the simple presence of a boy who could talk to dogs, and by the quiet wisdom of a dog who, through his kindness, taught everyone the value of empathy, connection, and above all, healing. The city would never be the same again. And somehow Juka would always be there, walking in everyone's memories, reminding them that to heal, you just need to be present.